Please be seated. The sitting is open. The court meets this afternoon to resume hearing the first round of the Gambia on the merits in the case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Gambia versus Myanmar, 11 states intervening. I shall give the floor to Mr. Andrew Lowenstein. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, members of the Court, good afternoon. We turn now to Myanmar's breaches of the Convention. I will begin by addressing the actus reus of genocide. I will be followed by Professor Sands and subsequently by Mr. Reichler, who will explain that genocidal intent is manifestly a reasonable inference, and in fact, the with the commission of any one of the acts set out in paragraphs A through E, provided it is perpetrated with the subsidiary and specific intent to that act, dolus specialis of genocidal intent. The Gambia's case implicates paragraphs A through D, which I will address in turn. The act falling under paragraph A is so killed members of the Rohingya group and did so in an unlawful manner. The UN fact-finding mission determined, quote, the Tatmadaw and other security forces, often in concert with civilians, intentionally and unlawfully killed Rohingya men, women, and children throughout the period under review, end quote. Despite that evidence, Myanmar denies having committed any actus reus under paragraph A. In addition to vaguely complaining about the supposed general deficiencies in the Gambia's evidence, issues that Mr. Reichler addressed on Monday, Myanmar appears to advance two arguments in support of this contention. First, without expressly denying that Rohingya civilians were killed during the clearance operations, Myanmar claims that any such killings would not fall under paragraph A because they would have been caused by a military attack requires that the acts be capable of bringing about the physical or biological destruction of the protected group in whole or in part. From this, Myanmar suggests that the estimated death toll of 10,000 was incapable of destroying the Rohingya group, given that it is said to represent a, quote, limited number, unquote, when compared to the overall Rohingya population in northern Rakhine State prior to the clearance operations. As to the first argument, the premise appears to be that every Rohingya was an ARSA terrorist. That, of course, is false, as Mr. Suleiman explained earlier today. Myanmar's assertion that the civilian casualties were not caused deliberately is likewise disproven by the evidence, which establishes beyond doubt that the Tatmadaw failed to distinguish between militants and civilians during the clearance operations. In fact, it did the opposite. It specifically targeted civilians. In short, the evidence leaves no doubt that the clearance operations were exactly what their name suggests: operations to destroy the Rohingya, undertaken under the pretext of counterterrorism, where members of a protected group are killed under the guise of a military operation, and convincing evidence shows they were targeted due to their protected status. Those killings fall within the scope of Article 2, Paragraph A. All the more so when the killings are committed against children, as I addressed this morning. As to Myanmar's second argument, the suggestion that an estimated death toll of 10,000 is somehow limited is, to be charitable, troubling. The argument is flawed regardless. As Professor Sands explained on Monday, genocide is not a numbers game, and the actus reus of killing is met irrespective of a specific number of deaths. As he also explained, and as you have heard throughout these hearings, the part of the Rohingya group targeted is, by any measure, substantial, or significant enough, to use the words of the court in the Bosnia case. I now turn to Paragraph B of Article 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. As held by the court, the serious bodily or mental harm within the meaning of Article 2, Paragraph B, must be such as to contribute to the physical or biological destruction of the group. Actus reus was established under Paragraph B on the basis of the serious bodily harm inflicted on Croats by the JNA and Serb forces, including through rape and sexual violence. As you heard Ms. Pasminosa this morning address the international jurisprudence concerning rape and sexual violence. As clarified by the ICTY Appeals Chamber, the forcible transfer of a civilian population out of an area can also, depending on the circumstances, be an additional means by which to ensure the physical destruction of the protected group by causing serious mental harm. In determining whether a forcible transfer contributes or amounts to conduct falling within Paragraph B, the Appeals Chamber observed that one may consider post-transfer suffering to assess whether serious mental harm was inflicted. Concerning serious bodily harm, Myanmar asserts that the Gambia's evidence is not capable of proving the acts satisfying the actus reus of genocide under Article 2, Paragraph B. However, the Gambia has presented a plethora of evidence, including UN investigative reports, witness statements, and medical testimony, that the Tatmadaw and security forces inflicted brutal, lasting, that is, serious bodily harm to members of the Rohingya group. For instance, the UN fact-finding mission determined that survivors of the clearance operations bear the after effects of bullet, burn, and knife wounds that cause not only disfigurement, but long-term serious injury. Survivors corroborate those findings, recounting in excruciating detail the injuries they sustained. The findings are supported by a range of medical evidence, including a study by Physicians for Human Rights, which concluded that the vast majority of the interviewed Rohingya refugees who suffered from long-term disabilities were injured because they were gunned down as they fled attackers. The organization specifically determined many of the bullet wounds have resulted in permanent neurological impairment that limits limb function and causes severe and persistent pain, making simple tasks like walking extremely painful or impossible. Sexual violence was central to the serious bodily harm inflicted against the Rohingya. The fact-finding mission concluded that during the clearance operations, rape was used as a form of torture. As Ms. Paspanoshcha explained this morning, the sexual violence itself was accompanied by the additional infliction of serious bodily harm, leaving victims bitten, scarred, or mutilated. With respect to mental harm, the evidence is equally compelling. The clearance operations were inherently traumatic. Survivors faced a multitude of terrors, including not least of being captured and killed. The fact-finding mission found that for those who did not immediately escape, the threat of impending death constituted serious mental harm as a separate genocidal act from the killing itself. Mr. President, parents had to endure the overwhelming pain of watching their children die. Here is but one example. A mother who had been forced to make the split-second decision as to which of her children to try to save posed the following question to the fact-finding mission. How can I continue with my life having made this choice? The mental anguish caused by the clearance operations crosses generational divides. Children witness parents being shot before their eyes. The OHCHR reported that the Tatmadaw forced small children to watch their family members being beaten, sexually abused, raped, or killed, rightly likening this to psychological torture. As one 16-year-old recounted to save the children, "We are now orphans. My siblings are always crying for their parents. They don't understand that they will never see them again." The fact-finding mission also determined that the horrendous sexual violence perpetrated during the clearance operation continues to have a devastating and lasting impact on the Rohingya community, not just physically, but also mentally. Ms. Paspanoshcha addressed that this morning. The clearance operations and forced exodus to Bangladesh resulted in lasting mental harm to those now forced to live in refugee camps. According to Fortify Rights' survey of Rohingya refugees, close to 90% of the respondents experienced symptoms indicative of depression. Over 60% reported symptoms indicative of post-traumatic stress disorder. Over 90% of the surveyed refugees reported challenges in carrying out common daily activities, such as maintaining basic hygiene, engaging in social or religious activities, or performing other daily tasks. In short, there is compelling evidence that Myanmar committed the actus reus of genocide by inflicting serious bodily and mental harm to members of the Rohingya group. This leads me to Article 2C, directly inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. As the court has held, paragraph C covers methods of physical destruction other than killing, whereby the perpetrator ultimately seeks the death of the members of the group. Such methods of destruction include, notably, deprivation of food, medical care, shelter, or clothing, as well as lack of hygiene, systematic expulsion from homes, or exhaustion as a result of excessive work or physical exertion. In addition to those methods of destruction, rape and other acts of sexual violence, where they take place on a sufficient scale, are also capable of bringing about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. As the ICTY Appeals Chamber confirmed in the Tolomir case, forced displacement or removal of a protected group from an area is also capable of being an act falling within paragraph C, so long as it leads to conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. The evidence shows that this actus reus was satisfied through several methods of physical destruction. First, as presented throughout these proceedings and recalled by Ms. Pashpanosha this morning, Rohingya women were subjected to pervasive rape and sexual violence, capable of bringing about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. The UN fact-finding mission found that the sexual violence perpetrated on a massive scale during the clearance operations was perpetrated with an intended effect, at least in part, to weaken the social cohesion of the Rohingya community and contribute to the destruction of the Rohingya as a group and the breakdown of the Rohingya way of life. In its rejoinder, Myanmar invoked the fact that in Croatia v. Serbia, the court declined to find actus reus under paragraph C on the basis of acts of rape committed against Croat women, in an apparent attempt to draw an analogy here. However, Myanmar overlooks the obvious. In the Croatia case, the court can only credit a number of instances of rape and other acts of sexual violence that were perpetrated within the context of the conflict. The factual record of the present case is entirely different. Second, in addition to the sexual violence, there has been and continues to be a widespread and severe deprivation of the Rohingyas' basic human needs. Prior to and after 2016, Myanmar imposed severe restrictions on the Rohingyas' movement, employment, access to food, and health care for decades. This resulted in, among other things, severe acute malnutrition among the Rohingya. Following the clearance operations, and as detailed in the Gambia's written submissions, a significant number of Rohingya remain confined in internment camps and ghettos, where their movement is severely restricted and their access to citizenship, basic services, and livelihoods is persistently impeded. Third, the forced mass exodus to Bangladesh resulting from the clearance operations also inflicted on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The fact-finding mission determined the clearance operations forced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to flee and walk for days or even weeks through forests and over mountains to reach Bangladesh. On this journey, many more died or were killed or injured. There was minimum shelter, with people having to sleep in the open and little food or water. Fourth, the systemic and well-documented destruction, burning, and bulldozing of inter alia houses, community buildings, and agricultural fields, resulting in the deprivation of essential means of subsistence, also falling within paragraph C. Finally, Mr. President, I turn to paragraph D. In addition to direct and indirect measures intended to prevent births within the group, such as forced sterilization or the separation of men, the Court has recognized that acts of rape and sexual violence can also fall within paragraph D, so long as they are of a kind which prevent births within the group. In order for that, the circumstances of the commission of those acts and their consequences must be such that the capacity of members of the group to procreate is affected, and the systematic nature of such acts considered. The case for actus reus under paragraph D is clear. First, there are discriminatory plans and policies which Ms. Paspinocha detailed on Monday. Those measures, and most notable Regional Order 1/2005, were specifically designed to target the Rohingya and suppress its population growth. As she explained, for years, Myanmar launched and pursued a coordinated campaign which involved requiring permission for marriage, restricting the number of Rohingya children, and denying the birth registration of newborns. In the words of the fact-finding mission, those measures, when considered both individually and cumulatively, appear targeted at the capacity of the group to live and reproduce normally. They are thus paradigmatic examples of the acts that fall under paragraph D. In addition to such measures, the Gambia submits that the sexual violence against the Rohingya was precisely the kind of systematic violence that would prevent births within the group. On this, you heard Ms. Paspinocha this morning. In its written submissions, Myanmar asserts that paragraph D is established only where the impugned population control measure in fact reduced the birth rate to such a degree that the very existence of the protected group is threatened. Likewise, Myanmar argues that in order to fall within paragraph D, sexual violence must have, in fact, prevented meaningful numbers of victims from procreating. Those arguments are misconceived for the same reasons discussed under paragraph A. Neither the Convention nor this Court's jurisprudence imposes any requirement that births must be reduced by a particular rate, or that demographic decline must be empirically demonstrated before paragraph D can be engaged. The focus of paragraph D is not on a particular statistical outcome. It is on the character of the measures and the intent with which they are adopted and enforced. As the plain text of paragraph D makes clear, perpetrated leaves no doubt that the acts indeed affected the capacity of the Rohingya to procreate. In that regard, I refer you to the study of legal action worldwide on this issue, which Ms. Pasternoster mentioned this morning. Mr. President, members of the Court, this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. I request that you invite Professor Sands to the podium.
I thank Mr. Lowenstein for his statement. I now invite Professor Philip Sands to address the Court. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, members of the Court, you have now heard the detailed, forensic and extensive evidence of Myanmar's acts against the Rohingya community. You've also homed in on the appalling events in 3 particular locations, Bingyi, Chut Pyin and Mang Nu, as well as other key places. You're aware now, fully aware, of the extensive and established pattern of conduct by the Tatmadaw across these villages and others in northern Rakhine State. A pattern that embraces extreme and brutal violence, killings, pervasive sexual harms, the targeting of children and women, the destruction of evidence, and then total impunity for every perpetrator. Mr. Suleiman brought to you in graphic detail some contemporaneous messages that were publicly circulated by the Tatmadaw on their Facebook pages and elsewhere as these terrible events were being prepared and as they unfolded. The UNFFM did not have the totality of the material that he took you to available to it. Nevertheless, it observed that there was a remarkable similarity in the timing of operations, the sequence of events, the types of weapons used, the assistance received from other security forces or ethnic Rakhine, and division of roles between perpetrators, the types of violence and the manner in which they were committed. With those Facebook posts, we now know that the remarkable similarity was not a consequence. It was not a coincidence. It was a consequence. The putting into effect of an intention that was planned and that was orchestrated. The purpose of this speech, then, is to show that a reasonable inference to be drawn from this mass of evidence points to the existence of a genocidal intent. And Mr. Reichler, following me, will tell you why it is the only reasonable inference within the meaning of the jurisprudence of this court. As I mentioned on Monday, it is invariably the case that in the absence of a published plan, a genocidal intent falls to be established on the basis of convincing circumstantial evidence. Myanmar did not document its genocidal plan by way of a direct or written evidence, and I can't take you to a written plan. Although I have to say, the Facebook messages we were taken to by Mr. Suleiman earlier this week do look very consistent with the existence of a plan. But what I can take you to is the circumstantial evidence, the nature of the acts, the manner in which they were perpetrated. And we say that that evidence is fully convincing in terms both of the particular circumstances of individual villages and the broader pattern of conduct of the clearance operations across the whole region. Mr. President, in determining the existence of a genocidal intent, the Court's previous judgments, with which I am very familiar, provide important guidance. The critical parts of the Court's previous jurisprudence on genocidal intent may be found in paragraphs 296 and 373 of the Court's Bosnia judgment. And the Court's approach was then repeated and clarified in the Croatia judgment, in particular at paragraphs 142 and 145. These paragraphs, when you take them together, clarify very helpfully the process of how this Court will look at the facts and determine and infer the existence of a genocidal intent from circumstantial evidence. And I can assure you, as my colleagues have, that the Gambia has paid the closest possible attention to the Court's words. The Court has set out key factors. Paragraph 296 of the Bosnia judgment identifies the factors to which the Court will have regard in determining whether there was a genocidal intent to destroy the Rohingya group as such, in whole or in part. And I quote, "The Court now turns to the requirement of Article 2 that there must be the intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. It recalls its earlier statement of the law, and in particular, the three elements there discussed: substantiality, the primary requirement, relevant geographic factors, and the associated opportunity available to the perpetrators, and emblematic or qualitative factors." Three key factors. Substantiality was then further explained in the 2015 judgment at paragraph 142, and I quote, "The destruction of the group in part, within the meaning of Article 2 of the Convention, must be assessed by reference to a number of criteria. In this regard, it held, in 2007, that the intent must be to destroy at least a substantial part of the particular group, and this is a critical criterion. The Court further noted that it is widely accepted that genocide may be found to have been committed where the intent is to destroy the group within a geographically limited area, and that accordingly the area of the perpetrator's activity and control are to be considered. Account must also be taken of the prominence of the allegedly targeted part within the group as a whole." Now, having cited from the ICTY judgment in Kurstic, the Court then stated as follows: "In evaluating whether the allegedly targeted part of a protected group is substantial in relation to the overall group, the Court will take into account the quantitative element as well as the evidence regarding the geographic location and prominence of the allegedly targeted part of the group. And it must be emphasised the quantitative element relates to the part of the group that is targeted, not the part of the group that as a result is in fact destroyed. Substantiality is a matter of intent, not actus reus." So, to recap, for a genocidal intent to be inferred, the 2007 judgment identifies three elements. First, substantiality, which the Bosnia judgment characterises as the primary requirement, clarified in the Croatia cases requiring assessment of the quantitative element. Second, relevant geographic factors and the associated opportunity available to the perpetrators. And third, emblematic or qualitative factors, including the prominence of the targeted part of the group. And we say all three of these elements are plainly met in this case. Paragraph 373 of the Bosnia judgment set out the standard of proof to establish genocidal intent from circumstantial evidence by reference to these three elements. It does so by reference to two distinct approaches in the absence of direct evidence of a general plan. First, the specific intent to destroy the group in whole or in part has to be convincingly shown by reference to particular circumstances. The requisite standard in this case is that the proof must be convincing. And second, and distinctly, the Court states that for a pattern of conduct to be accepted as evidence of its existence, it would have to be such that it could only point to the existence of such intent. This distinction is really important. It may be that there are particular circumstances, perhaps in respect of a single incident or place, that was the case in relation to Srebrenica, that are enough to show convincingly, on their own, and without any need to have reference to any pattern of conduct, a genocidal intent. Or it may be that there is a wider pattern of conduct from which genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference. Or it may be, third possibility, and we say that's the case in the present matter, that there exist both particular circumstances established by convincing evidence, for example, in relation to each of the three villages separately, and a pattern of conduct that establishes genocidal intent as the only reasonable inference. I'm going to address the application of each of these identified features to the circumstances of the present case. Substantiality, first. On the quantitative element, let me reiterate what I said on Monday and what Mr. Lowenstein has repeated this afternoon. Genocide is not a numbers game. There's no minimum of victims necessary for genocide to have been committed. You don't have to have destroyed all of a group, or even most of it. What matters is that the targeted part of the group that is intended to be destroyed, that is substantial, so that the targeting of that part is, and I quote from your judgment in Bosnia, significant enough to have an impact on the group as a whole, end of quote. And I'm sorry to say that substantiality is convincingly established in the present case. The number of Rohingya targeted during the Tatmadaws clearance operations was, by any reasonable standard, very significant, very substantial. This is because of the sheer number of villages attacked over the two waves of clearance operations, the number of people living in each of those villages, and the nature and extent of the attacks in each of those villages. I have to say, we find it difficult to imagine that this court could reasonably conclude that the number of Rohingya who were targeted and then actually the subjects of attacks could not be characterized as significant. According to the UNFFM, the second wave of clearance operations alone, which began on the 25th of August 2017, resulted in at least 10,000 deaths. And some estimates have stated a figure more than twice as high as that number. That's just the second wave of clearance operations. It's also, of course, as you've heard, highly relevant that many children were targeted explicitly and killed. And you're going to hear specific accounts from the witnesses next week on that kind of targeting. And that is not targeting as counter-terror activity. As the joint interveners make clear in their very persuasive submission, children are essential to the survival of the group. So the specific targeting of children, which is fully established by the evidence before you, is fully indicative on its own of an intent to destroy a substantial part of the group. The clearance operations were also conducted on a significant scale, and this too bears on the quantitative aspect of the court's assessment. The UN FFM verified through multiple sources that clearance operations took place in at least 54 different locations, with accounts of other clearance operations in a further 22 locations. Those operations all took place at around the same time. What an amazing coincidence. And that is totally consistent with a coordinated and pre-prepared plan of action. It is on its own reflective of a particular intention. You don't accidentally attack 76 different sites at the same time. That requires planning and coordination. Their widespread and concurrent nature indicates that they were planned acts of violence. These were not operations that were reactive to incidents that occurred, and that is not even argued. I have to say that Myanmar's evidence to the contrary on this really is hopeless. Two of the FFM's indicators of genocidal intent are, we say, especially significant in this respect. The extreme brutality of the acts, first. And second, the sheer nature and scale and embrace of acts of sexual violence. Sexual violence is not ever an act of counter-terror or insurgency. And it is these elements that evoke the court's observations in Croatia versus Serbia, that in relation to a pattern of conduct, genocidal intent can be inferred from, and I quote, the scale and allegedly systematic nature of the attacks, the fact that the attacks are said to have caused casualties and damage far in excess of what was justified by military necessity, the specific targeting of members of the protected group, and the nature, extent, and degree of the injuries caused to the protected population. And I apologize that we've come back more than once to this language, but it's absolutely central to establishing a genocidal intent. Mr. President, any assessment of the quantitative aspect of substantiality in this case must take account of the overall scale of the timing of the attacks within each location and numerically across so many different locations and their systematic nature. The evidence before the court has a common purpose to destroy the Rohingya group, in whole or in part. Let me put it as a question on the basis of what you've heard. Would you say that it's a reasonable inference from the evidence before you that the intention was to destroy the group in whole or in part? That is a personal question for each of you to reflect upon and for each of you to come to your own conclusion. But can that question really be answered in the negative? We really think it cannot. And that is the first step to finding genocidal intent, a reasonable genocidal intent. Let me put it another way. Even if, contrary to what is required by the law, even if one were to take the narrowest of focuses on the number of actual victims, rather than on the size of the targeted part of the protected group, then the number of Rohingya alone killed by the Tatmadaw clearance operations was at least as substantial in respect of the group as the number of Bosnian Muslims killed at Srebrenica. As you know, painfully, some 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men were killed at Srebrenica out of a total population of around 50,000. That population having swelled as people fled from nearby areas. That means around 16% of the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica were murdered in the genocide. Now let's look at each of the three villages addressed this week by the Gambia, where the particular circumstances convincingly demonstrate a genocidal intent. In Mingi, 750 people were murdered. About 400 of them were inhabitants of the villages, while others had more recently fled there, as had happened at Srebrenica. So for the inhabitants alone, it's 10% of the village's population. But if you take those who had fled to the area, it climbs to closer to 20% of the total. A population of 4,300 at the time of the clearance operation. In Chut Pyin, out of a total population of 1,200, 328 people were killed. That is the murder of some 25% or more of the entire Rohingya population. In Mang Nu, the total population of the village at the time of the clearance operations is not as clear, but the UNFFM describes there being about 400 households, and 100 people were killed in that village. That means 1 in 4 households had someone killed. That is, by any standard, a substantial number. But it's not only the number of deaths that's going to be relevant. As Mr. Lowenstein set out, the killings are just one of the elements of the actus reus of genocide. As the evidence before you makes plain, there were acts of other kinds that took place. Hundreds of Rohingya women and young girls were subjected to sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya were forcibly displaced from their homes. Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh is currently home, it's a staggering figure, to about 1 million Rohingya refugees, making it the largest refugee camp in the whole world. And at least 178 Rohingya villages have been totally destroyed. Not damaged, totally destroyed, burned to the ground. And what that means is there is no village to which the survivors, tens of thousands of them from those villages, will ever be able to return. I really invite you to focus on what it means to have 178 villages destroyed. Nothing on that scale, nothing close to that scale, and the sheer numbers of the targets show beyond any doubt, not even a reasonable doubt, the existence of a reasonably inferable genocidal intent. Let me turn to the second criterion identified by the court, the geographic element of the targeted group, and the opportunity that was available to the perpetrators to kill and to maim. The court has noted in a passage that I took you to earlier that it's widely accepted that genocide may be found to have been committed where the intent is to destroy the group within a geographically limited area. And what this means, according to the cannot be characterized as genocide within the meaning of the 1948 Convention, because even more people could have been targeted or killed. It's not genocide, they say, because we didn't make use of the full opportunities available to us to target or to kill. Now, that really is not an attractive argument. But more importantly, it ignores the point of the court's jurisprudence, that we have to focus not on the totality of all areas, but the limited areas where the activities took place. You've said that feature is to be taken into account, and we have taken it into account in making our arguments. Although the Tatmadaw carried out clearance operations across 3 townships in northern Rakhine State, its focus was more extensive. According to data from the UN Operational Satellite Applications Programme area, the targeted area of the Tatmadaw's clearations stretches across more than 110 kilometres from the northernmost tip of Mungdao Township all the way to the settlements of Khotan Kuk and Chen Kali on the southern coast. And this covers the area, amazing coincidence, that just happens to have the largest Rohingya population in northern Rakhine State. And it's only in northern Rakhine State, of course, that the Rohingya are a majority of the population, where they make up 80% of the population. The fact that some Rohingya in other areas were not targeted in the same way cannot and does not undermine the genocidal intent that is a reasonable inference from Myanmar's actions in the geographically more limited targeted area. It is precisely to account for such realities that this court, in its earlier cases, identified the need to address the particular geographical area of a perpetrator's activities in considering the substantiality threshold, not the totality of all geographic areas. The area that was targeted in this case is a significant and representative geographical area for the Rohingya group, and its targeting is plainly of a substantial part of the Rohingya group by any reasonable standard. In respect of the opportunity available to the perpetrator, Myanmar identifies other opportunities that it says it had but did not take to kill members of the Rohingya. For example, on Myanmar's approach, you, the court, are invited to take account of the fact that there have been no killings of Rohingya in the International Displaced Persons Camp, where approximately 126,000 Rohingya have been confined, and the fact that it would have been possible to kill a lot more Rohingya inhabitants of Rakhine State, but somehow that did not happen. But the argument ignores the fact that killing is not the only genocidal act of relevance. It ignores the fact that the court has made clear that genocide may definitionally target the group in part, in a limited geographic area. And it ignores the fact that the part of the group targeted just with acts other than killing. It has confined them in camps, under conditions, with restrictions on movement, employment, livelihood, access to health care. And we say that too is genocidal in effect, because the confinement destroys the community's way of life and its culture. and the conditions to which the community is exposed are calculated to ensure their destruction as a group. The third and final consideration in respect of the targeting of a substantial part of the group is whether there are emblematic or qualitative factors which make the targeted part of the group particularly significant. And there are. You can read it for yourself in the fact-finding mission report. There was targeting of, I quote, educated, wealthy and influential men, unquote, who comprised the Rohingya leadership. They were, according to the FFM, and I quote, specifically targeted, end of quote. And so too were children targeted, as you've heard from Mr. Lowenstein, described in appalling detail. The intentional killing of children offers the clearest evidence that Myanmar's actions against the Rohingya were committed with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. What other reason is there for targeting children and infants? What is the justification for throwing a child into a fire pit or into a river? What is the justification? We look forward to hearing what the justifications are later in the week. And of course the same can be said of sexual violence, which targeted so many women and young girls. The acts that have been described to you are shocking by any standard, in nature and in scale. Ask yourself the question, what was the intention of those acts? Counterinsurgency, really? In short, emblematic groups were targeted, and that offers further confirmation of the existence of a genocidal intent. I turn back briefly to the standard of proof of genocidal intent set out by the court in Bosnia, Serbia at paragraph 373. In the absence, as I've said, of direct evidence of a general plan, we have the two approaches to the standard for circumstantial evidence. Particular circumstances requiring convincing evidence, and a pattern of conduct requiring that genocidal intent is to be established on the basis of the only reasonable inference test. There's no magic to the court's formulation, and in fact it seems ultimately to be an approach with which both parties and all the interveners largely agree. These are pretty regular and ordinary legal thresholds familiar to anyone involved in practice before this court and other courts. But they point to essentially the same position. You've got to be sure from the evidence that the acts identified took place with a genocidal intent. And we submit that the particular circumstances of the acts that took place in Chutpien, Mingi and Mangnao and at the other villages identified by the FFM allow the court to conclude with really no difficulty at all that a genocidal intent is established by reference to the standard of convincing evidence because of the nature of the attacks, because of the extreme brutality, because of the extensive and sadistic sexual violence, including against children, the heinous murder of infants and children, and the substantial number of Rohingya affected in these locations. To the extent that the court needs anything more to be convinced to get you over the line, I refer you to the submissions of Mr. Suleiman on Monday, and in particular that part of his submissions that addressed, and I quote, Myanmar's clandestine anti-Rohingya propaganda campaign on Facebook, end of quote. Please go back over that material and read it against the background of what actually happened and ask yourself the question, what does that establish as the intent of those actions? The Facebook messages, the other messages circulated at the time of clearance operations offer the most graphic and compelling confirmation that these acts were plainly accompanied by a genocidal intent. And as regards the wider pattern of conduct standard, we submit that exactly the same conclusion is easily justified. This is not just across those three villages, but the 3 taken together with the 51 other locations identified in northern Rakhine State where clearance operations took place. Places where the Rohingya villagers were killed, where girls were raped and mutilated, where fleeing children were shot in the back or thrown into burning fires, and where villages and homes were razed to the ground by fire. Taken together, we invite you to ask yourself a simple question. Anyone in this room can ask the question. Having regard to the totality of the evidence that you have heard this week on the acts that have been carried out and the accompanying material you have seen, is it a reasonable inference that they reflected a genocidal intent? The answer to that question is straightforward. The question answers itself. It has to be yes. And this is all the more so when you take into account the other material to which I've not yet taken you, the history of discriminatory persecution, the long-standing anti-Rohingya hate propaganda, the videos of utterances by soldiers as they carried out their atrocities, the clandestine propaganda, the destruction of evidence, and the total impunity that has followed now for almost a decade. The UN FFM assessed all of these elements, although you have more material available to you than they did. It found a strikingly similar pattern of conduct. How could it possibly have concluded otherwise? It identified 7 indicators of genocidal intent and found every single one of them to be present in the case of the Rohingya. We've taken you through those indicators over the course of our presentations this week. The FFM concluded that the inference of a genocidal intent is a reasonable one. You've got even more material than they had available to them. So we invite the court to conclude, as a first step in its analysis on genocidal intent, that it is a reasonable inference to conclude that the pattern of conduct reflects a genocidal intent. The conclusion is supported by the language of the 1948 Convention, by the interpretation and application of the Convention by this court, by other international criminal tribunals and courts, and by national courts. And in particular, I'm thinking of the courts of Germany, which have done so much to clarify and help on genocidal intent. It would be extraordinary, we say, for the court to reach a different conclusion than the FFM, namely that a genocidal intent is a reasonable inference to be drawn from all of this material. And now Mr. Reichler will set out why the genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference to be drawn from the pattern of conduct. I thank the court once again for its attention and invite you to call Mr. Reichler to the bar.
I thank Professor Sand for his statement. I now call Mr. Paul Reichler to the podium. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, members of the court, good afternoon. Inference to draw from its pattern of conduct. In fact, it is more than a manifestly reasonable inference. It is the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from that conduct. This is true for at least 2 compelling reasons, upon which I will focus this afternoon. First, the inference that Myanmar asks you to draw from its conduct that their intention was counterterrorism is manifestly unreasonable. This is the only alternative inference that Myanmar offers. In light of the evidence you have heard this week, an inference of counterterrorism would be both counterintuitive and counterfactual. It is simply not reasonable. I won't rehash that evidence. You heard it this morning from my good friend, Mr. Suleiman. You don't need to hear it again from me. I will simply state the 9 conclusions that we say must inevitably be drawn from that evidence. 1, deliberately targeting, shooting indiscriminately at, and massacring thousands of Rohingya civilians, unarmed, unthreatening, and defenseless Rohingya civilians, is not counterterrorism. It is the opposite of counterterrorism. It is mass premeditated murder. And this is what the evidence shows Myanmar did systematically in scores of Rohingya villages. 2, inflicting extreme brutality on these civilians by setting fire to their homes and burning them alive, by rounding up men and young boys and killing them execution style, by butchering women and children with bayonets and long knives, by bashing in infants with rifle butts in front of their mothers before killing them too. This is not counterterrorism. Yet this too is what the UN fact-finding mission found to have taken place in multiple Rohingya villages across Rakhine State. 3, engaging in widespread acts of sexual violence and cruelty is not counterterrorism. Yet it is irrefutable that the Tatmadaw raped and gang-raped hundreds of Rohingya women and girls, including children, in these villages, often torturing and mutilating them by cutting off their breasts and slicing their genitals in too many cases and too many different villages to be coincidental. This cannot be counterterrorism. 4, raising and completely destroying more than 175 Rohingya villages and partially or mostly destroying over 210 more cannot be counterterrorism. Counterterrorism doesn't destroy villages, it protects them by securing them against attack and bringing physical safety and protection to the inhabitants. This is the exact opposite of what the evidence shows Myanmar did. 5, it is not counterterrorism when the Tatmadaw completely ignore and egregiously violated their own rules of engagement, as they did during the clearance operations in scores of Rohingya villages across northern Rakhine State. And they treat the entire Rohingya population, men, women, children, the elderly, the infirm, as an enemy to be destroyed. As Professor Newton, the counterterrorism expert, explains, Myanmar knows what counterterrorism is and what it requires. Its armed forces are not primitive. They are sophisticated, well-organized, disciplined, and obedient to the chain of command. Their rules of engagement reflect modern, universal standards, incorporating the laws of war, emphatic on the need to protect the civilian population rather than target it yet they might just as well have tossed the rules of engagement into the same fires they set to destroy the Rohingya and their villages for all the attention they paid to them. 6, the clearance operations were so wildly and blatantly disproportionate to the threat that ARSA was said to represent, and involved such an overwhelming number of troops and use of force in relation to that threat that it cannot be reasonably inferred that Myanmar's intent in carrying out these operations was simply to defeat a low-level, poorly armed, and ill-equipped group of rebels who controlled absolutely no territory. Of course, Myanmar had the right to respond to ARSA's provocations, whatever their size or threat. We don't contend otherwise. What we do contend is that it is not reasonable to infer that the Tatmadaw were deployed in such numbers and force in so many Rohingya villages in response to ARSA, especially when the clearance operations targeted the entire Rohingya population in those villages, as if every single Rohingya was, by Myanmar's definition, an ARSA combatant. And these murderous operations were carried out in more than 180 Rohingya villages, as you were shown this morning, in which Myanmar itself admits there was no ARSA presence. If their objective was to defeat ARSA, the means they chose was to destroy all the Rohingya as a group. That is not counterterrorism. 7, the clearance operations in northern Rakhine State differed markedly from actual counterterrorism or counterinsurgency operations carried out by the Tatmadaw elsewhere in Myanmar. Myanmar contends that the same modus operandi were employed in those other regions where they have not been accused of genocide, and it suggests that if similar operations were considered counterterrorism there, it is reasonable to infer that they were counterterrorism operations here. But this is based on an entirely false predicate. Myanmar has not provided the evidence to show that the clearance operations against the Rohingya bear a significant resemblance to its operations elsewhere. And the UN fact-finding mission, whose mandate included investigating and reporting on Myanmar's operations against insurgencies in other parts of the country, concluded that those operations did not bear the hallmarks of genocidal intent that the mission found to exist during the clearance operations against the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State. 8, within Rakhine State, there was an insurgency larger and more threatening than that of ARSA. If the intent of the clearance operations was counterterrorism, why were they not directed at the Arab? Why were ethnic Rakhine villages undisturbed? In mixed villages, why were only Rohingya houses and structures destroyed, with Rakhine structures left standing? The Arakan Army, which, as you heard, the UN mission describes as a well-trained force that operates under a clear command structure with a significant military armory, differed from ARSA not only in its size and potency, but also, and most significantly for present purposes, in its ethnic and religious composition. As you have heard, the Arakan Army was composed of ethnic Rakhine Buddhists. You've seen the satellite imagery. In the many villages depicted, only the Rohingya areas were burned to the ground, while the Rakhine areas were untouched. Why did the Tatmadaw attack Rohingya civilians and villages, but not Rakhine civilians or villages, when the bigger threat of terrorism was from the Rakhine Arakan army? The answer is obvious. This was not counterterrorism. This was counter-Rohingya. 9, and finally, as distinguished from the ethnic Rakhine, the Rohingya were despised, discriminated against, and targeted by the Myanmar government based on their race and religion since long before ARSA existed. It is undisputed that Myanmar refused to recognize or accept the Rohingya as a national racial group, excluding them as foreign Bengalis, despite their presence in the country to other ethnic, racial, and religious groups. They were also regularly subjected to barrages of hate speech, not only as tolerated by the government, but as practiced by it, especially by the Tatmadaw in public declarations by its leaders and on social media, and by its incitement of other racial groups, including Rakhine Buddhists, to despise and rise up violently against them. As publicly proclaimed by the Tatmadaw's supreme commander, the very presence of the Rohingya had long been a problem, an alien group whose procreation threatened to swallow up Myanmar's favored racial and religious groups. And the clearance operations were launched to finally solve this problem. This was not counterterrorism. It was the antithesis of counterterrorism. It was genocide. Mr. President, members of the court, in their written pleadings, the parties have placed 2 different inferences before you. Only 2 inferences to be drawn from Myanmar's pattern of conduct. We say the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from the evidence is that Myanmar acted with the intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group, as such, in whole or in part. They say that the evidence permits you to infer that all of this conduct was intended as counterterrorism and nothing more. Mr. President, this is simply not sustainable. It is not reasonable. As Professor Sand said, it is hopeless. The evidence before you not only fails to permit a reasonable inference that Myanmar's intent was counterterrorism, it precludes such an inference. I come now to the second reason why genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from Myanmar's pattern of conduct. This assumes, quod non, that Myanmar's motive, or at least one of its motives in carrying out the clearance operations in northern Rakhine State was, as it tells us, to respond to arson. Even if this were a motive, which we do not accept, it would still be the case that the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from Myanmar's pattern of conduct is that its intent was to destroy the Rohingya as a group. This is because the law and your jurisprudence recognize a distinction between motive and intent, as reflected in the judgments of the ICTY, on which the court relied in both the Bosnia and Croatia cases. The point was made most clearly by the ICTY Appeals Chamber's ruling in the Krnolulak case, citing the earlier Jelicic case, in which it explained that in determining whether the specific intent required to prove genocide is present, there is a, quote, necessity to distinguish specific intent from motive. In particular, quote, the personal motive of the perpetrator of the crime of genocide may be, for example, to obtain personal economic benefits or political advantage or some form of power. The existence of a personal motive does not preclude the perpetrator from also having the specific intent to commit genocide. In the Blazkowicz case, the appeals chamber further explained that, quote, mens rea is the mental state or degree of fault which the accused held at the relevant time. Motive is generally considered as that which causes a person to act. As far as criminal responsibility is concerned, motive is generally irrelevant in international criminal law. Where the perpetrator is a state, like Myanmar, the motives of its senior officials may also be personal or political and may include, for example, to defeat an insurgent force, such as ARSA. On Myanmar's case, we can proceed on an assumption, quod non, without agreeing that this may have been one of their motives for launching the clearance operations at the time they chose. But there is no inconsistency between Myanmar or its officials having this motive and at the same time having a specific intent during the clearance operations while committing the actus reus of genocide to destroy the Rohingya as a group, either as an end in itself or as a means of defeating ARSA by depriving it of its potential base of support. The motive to defeat ARSA can thus exist alongside a specific intent to destroy the Rohingya group, or a substantial part of it, manifested in the manner and means by which the clearance operations were carried out against the civilian population. Indeed, the Tatmadaws' putative motive and specific intent were complementary. The ostensible object of defeating ARSA was pursued by means of the deliberate destruction of the Rohingya group as such. The stated objective served as a convenient facade behind which the Rohingya group as a whole could be targeted for destruction, as the evidence shows it was. Now, this is not the first armed conflict in which a warring party seized the opportunity under cover of combat to target for destruction a despised racial, ethnic, or religious minority, which it treated as an enemy population to be destroyed. On Monday, I recalled Judge Cansado Trindade's prescient words from the Croatia case, which ring as true as ever in the circumstances of this case. Quote, the perpetrators of genocide will almost always allege that their actions were taken pursuant to an ongoing military conflict. They're not very original. Yet genocide may be a means of achieving military objectives, just as ready as military conflict may be a means for instigating a genocidal plan. The ICTR considered this very issue in the Akayesu case, about which my colleagues have spoken. The trial chamber there faced the question, quote, whether the tragic events that took place in Rwanda occurred solely within the context of the conflict, which was between the Rwandan Armed Forces and the Tutsi-led Rwanda Patriotic Front, or RPF. The Chamber found that these events did not take place solely within that context, finding that, quote, the genocide did indeed take place against the Tutsi group alongside the conflict. The tribunal explained, quote, the massacres which occurred in Rwanda in 1994 had a specific objective, namely the extermination of the Tutsi, who were targeted especially because of their Tutsi origin, and not because they were RPF fighters. In any case, the Tutsi children and pregnant women would naturally not have been among the fighters. Likewise, the UN fact-finding mission emphasized the Rohingya civilian villagers of northern Rakhine State, including, but not limited to, pregnant women and children who were killed by the Tatmadaw, were targeted because they were Rohingya, not because they were ARSA fighters. Another example can be found in the Karadzic case, in the appeals chamber of the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals. Conviction of genocide for his role in the Srebrenica massacre. He claimed in both the trial and appeals chambers that certain statements attributed to him demonstrated that he had military objectives, thus, in his view, ruling out genocidal intent as the only reasonable inference. The appeals chamber rejected this argument and upheld his conviction. Quote, Karadzic merely provided an alternative interpretation of the evidence, but failed to demonstrate that the trial chamber's interpretation of his statement or its reliance on it in establishing his intent was unreasonable. Belgium, in its intervention in these proceedings, cited a decision by a German court, the Higher Regional Court of Frankfurt, in the criminal prosecution of an ISIS fighter for participation in the genocide of the Yazidis in northern Iraq. The court there found that genocide was an interim goal in the Islamic State's broader military campaign aimed at establishing a caliphate. For Belgium, the case illustrates that genocidal intent may be present, quote, even when the ultimate military objective with which the intent coincides goes beyond the immediate destruction of the protected group. Myanmar against the Arakan army. This gives new meaning to the concept of strange bedfellows, and it reflects the ultimate cynicism of both members of this unholy union. But the clearance operations did fulfill their intention of destroying the Rohingya in substantial part as a group within Myanmar by killing many thousands of them, clearing them out of hundreds of their villages, preventing them from returning, and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee to safety in Bangladesh, where they remain, without any foreseeable hope of repatriation, in the squalid and life-draining conditions of the world's largest refugee camp. Mission accomplished. At least that is what the Tatmadaw and its supreme commander and head of state, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and his criminal accomplices could smugly conclude. about the success of their carefully planned clearance operations. Mr. President, the Court itself has recognized the difference between motive and intent in its own reasoning and by its reliance on the relevant ICTY judgments in both the Bosnia and Croatia cases. In Bosnia, the Court stated that the intent to commit genocide is, quote, to be distinguished from other reasons or motives the perpetrator may have, end of quote. It found in that case that the Serb perpetrators massacred Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica with genocidal intent, despite finding that, quote, an essential motive of much of the Bosnian Serb leadership to create a larger Serb state by a war of conquest, if necessary, did not necessarily require the destruction of the Bosnian Muslims and other communities, but their expulsion. Judge Bandari, recalling the Bosnia case in his separate opinion in the Croatia case, agreed that, quote, genocidal intent may exist simultaneously with other ulterior motives. And he called attention to the ICTY's finding in Popovic that the massacre at Srebrenica, quote, the massacre at Srebrenica enclave was in part motivated by the strategic advantage of uniting a greater Serbia. He went on to observe, quote, never was it suggested that this tactical motivation precluded the attack from possessing genocidal intent. In the Bosnia case, as you know, the Court found that outside of Srebrenica, an intent to commit genocide was not the only reasonable inference that could be drawn from the Bosnian Serb forces' pattern of conduct. This was because the Court found that it could also be reasonably inferred from the evidence in that case that the intent of those forces was the expulsion or ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Serb-occupied territory rather than their destruction. However, the Court made a point of explaining that where the evidence warrants, it can be concluded that acts of ethnic cleansing have been committed with genocidal intent. Quote, this is not to say that acts described as ethnic cleansing may never constitute genocide, if they are such as to be characterized as, for example, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. That is to say, with a view to the destruction of the group as distinct from its removal from the region. In the present case, as we underscored on Monday, Myanmar does not defend itself by arguing that its clearance operations were for the purpose of ethnic cleansing or the removal of the Rohingya group from the region they inhabited. It argues that its purpose in carrying out these operations was counterterrorism. But the lessons from the Bosnia and ICTY cases are just as pertinent. What they tell us is whatever the motive for the perpetrator's actus reus, if the particular circumstances or pattern of conduct show that this act or these acts were carried out with specific intent to destroy the group, genocidal intent will be the only reasonable inference. On this basis, the only reasonable inference to be drawn from the killings, burnings, extreme brutality, sexual violence, destruction of villages, and massive forced displacement of the Rohingya population carried out by Myanmar in the name of counterterrorism must be that Myanmar acted with genocidal intent. The Croatia case is also pertinent. There, as in the Bosnia case, the court found that genocidal intent was not the only reasonable inference that could be drawn from the Serb forces' pattern of conduct. Instead, it concluded that the acts constituting the actus reus of genocide, quote, were not committed with the intent to destroy the Croats, but rather with that of forcing them to leave the regions concerned so that an ethnically homogeneous Serb state could be created. However, here again, the court accepted that genocidal intent could have been established if the evidence had shown that, quote, the forced displacement was carried out in circumstances calculated to result in the total or partial physical destruction of the group. Thus, even where the perpetrator's motive is forced displacement or ethnic cleansing, a finding that it acted with genocidal intent is not precluded if the intent of the perpetrators at the time they carried out these acts was to destroy the group. The joint interveners, Germany, France, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, make the same point, that forced displacement can be carried out in circumstances that demonstrate genocidal intent. Citing the ICTY, they say, in relation to Article 11b of the Convention, forced displacement may, depending on the circumstances of the case, inflict serious mental harm by causing grave and long-term disadvantage to a person's ability to lead a normal and constructive life so as to contribute or tend to contribute to the destruction of the group as a whole or a part thereof. As we made clear in our written pleadings, we agree. In fact, we have already said the massive forcible displacement of the Rohingya group, with hundreds of thousands forced to flee across the border to Bangladesh during and in the wake of the clearance operations that destroyed or partially destroyed more than 390 Rohingya villages, was carried out, along with the other atrocities attendant to the clearance operations with the specific intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group within Myanmar. What the jurisprudence shows is that the perpetrator's motive may be forced displacement or ethnic cleansing to establish an ethnically pure state, or it may be counterterrorism to defeat an insurgency. But motive, whatever it is, does not tell us whether genocide has been committed. That depends on the intent of the perpetrators in carrying out these actions and whether the particular circumstances or the pattern of conduct manifests a specific intention to destroy a protected group as such, in whole or in part. What this means is that it is insufficient for Myanmar to tell us that its motive for launching the clearance operations against hundreds of Rohingya villages was counterterrorism, even if such were the case, quod non. That motive, even in the unlikely event that the court were to suspend disbelief and allow itself to be persuaded that it was present, does not displace or disprove the existence of genocidal intent. Far from it. On the evidence before the court, evidence which, as you have heard, is compelling and overwhelming, there is only one reasonable inference that can be drawn regarding Myanmar's intent to destroy the Rohingya group as such. Mr. President, it is worth observing that the court has used different linguistic formulations to express this standard of proof. which has come to be known as the only reasonable inference standard. In the Bosnia case, for example, the court said, in respect of genocidal intent, for a pattern of conduct to be accepted as evidence of its existence, it would have to be such that it could only point to the existence of such intent. In the Croatia case, the court framed the question thusly: is there a pattern of conduct from which the only reasonable inference to be drawn is an intent of the Serb authorities to destroy in part the protected group? Then, in explaining its approach to answering this question, the court said that the court will examine first whether the acts committed by the JNA, the Yugoslav Army, and Serb forces form part of a pattern of conduct. And if so, it will then consider whether an intent to destroy the Croat group is the only reasonable conclusion that can be inferred from that pattern of conduct. So we see from these two cases three different ways of describing the applicable standard of proof of genocidal intent. Evidence that, quote, could only point to it, evidence from which it is, quote, the only reasonable inference to be drawn, and evidence from which it is, quote, the only reasonable conclusion that can be inferred. To be clear, we are not suggesting that there is any uncertainty about what the standard of proof is. There is no uncertainty. The different formulations in the Bosnia and Croatia cases, in our view, all describe the same standard, the only reason. Or only reasonable conclusion, we understand that other inferences or conclusions, besides an intent to destroy the protected group, may be possible or plausible, but they will not prevent a finding of dolus specialis unless they are reasonable. There may be other points on the compass, but they are irrelevant if the arrow, quote, could only point to genocidal intent. We say, based on the evidence, that counterterrorism is not even a possible or a plausible inference to be made in this case. It is not even a point on the compass. But even if it was, it would not prevent genocidal intent from being the only reasonable inference, because counterterrorism is by no means a reasonable inference. The court's approach to inferring intent works. It works because it understands and takes account of human nature. Science teaches us that human beings rarely act for one single reason. Freud explained that any human behavior is typically caused by multiple interconnected factors. Human motivation, in his view, is driven by, quote, a seething cauldron of conflicting motives and desires, rather than any single reason. The court's task, as defined in its jurisprudence, is not to dive into that cauldron and psychoanalyze the perpetrators, in this case the Tatmadaw, but to discern from the particular circumstances or from their pattern of conduct whatever else may be seething among their conflicting motives, they acted with a specific intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group, in whole or in part. In its intervention, the Democratic Republic of Congo cites to a 2024 treatise entitled The Genocide Convention, an article-by-article commentary authored by Professors Tams, Burster, and Schiffbauer. In it, the distinguished authors observe that, quote, no monocausal psychological relationship is required to prove dolus specialis, and, quote, the victim's group affiliation may be one reason to act within a bundle of motives. They go on to explain, quote, within the complex realm of human decision-making, even the perpetrators themselves will often be incapable to discern the extent to which their actions relied on one motive versus another within a multitude of motives. All the more, a court would have tremendous difficulty in attaining adequate clarity regarding the significance and hierarchical structure of the motives at play. This is why we submit criminal law and international law distinguish between motive and intent. Thus, even if within their own seething cauldron, the Tatmadaw harbored a motive to combat ARSA, which we say Myanmar has not proven, it would be irrelevant to the central issue before the court, whether they acted with the intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group in whole or in part. In sum, what both the court's jurisprudence and our knowledge of human behavior teach us is that Myanmar can incant the word counterterrorism all it wants, but there are no magic words that can turn fiction into reality, or in this case, turn its proffered inference, which is completely belied by its own conduct during the clearance operations, into a reasonable one. We submit that the compelling evidence you have heard this week and have seen in our written pleadings should leave you with no doubt that the only reasonable inference, the only reasonable conclusion you can draw from it is that Myanmar's armed forces acted with the specific intent to destroy the Rohingya as a group. As the court said in the Bosnia case, quote, where these requirements are satisfied, the law must not shy away from referring to the crime committed by its proper name, genocide. Mr. President, before concluding, I wish to make a correction to something I said in my presentation Monday afternoon. In discussing the witness statements submitted by the Gambia, I said that of the 48 statements, not including those supplied by the IIMM, 14 had the names of the witnesses redacted for their protection at their request. The correct number is 30. I apologize for the error and for any inconvenience this might have caused the court or the registry. This, Mr. President, members of the court, concludes my presentation this morning, and it also concludes the Gambia's presentation for the day. I thank you again for your kind courtesy and patient attention, and I bid you a good evening.
I thank Mr. Reichler, whose statement brings this sitting to a close. The oral proceedings in the case will resume tomorrow, Thursday, the 15th of January 2026 at 10 a.m., when the court will hear the remainder of the Gambia's first round of oral argument. The sitting is closed.